Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And thank you for joining us for episode number 13. We thank you for listening to Intimate Judaism and appreciate your always sharing and promoting the podcast. Because of the sensitive topics that Talli and I discuss, we need your help to let people know about this podcast. So please continue sharing and help us get the word out. Visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. And please continue to send us your questions and feedback to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com.
13 episodes.
Yeah, and this actually is our last episode before our summer hiatus.
So we've been doing this for at least a year.
That's right. And we have a pilot episode also. So yeah, we've done a lot in the past year. It's been great for me. I've really enjoyed it.
So this is a good opportunity to thank our listeners again for listening to our podcast, for sending us emails, suggestions, feedback. You've been great. And we are going to go after this episode for a short hiatus and begin again in September. The topic today will be about conflict. Many listeners have written in to say that on some of our episodes, when we talk about real challenges, we've spoken about some of these challenges as though the couple is a unit, as though they are on the same page with some of the challenges that we have raised, particularly around the area of adhering to the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha. Many people have asked us to address what happens when couples don't see eye to eye. We did have an episode about when couples don't see eye to eye regarding the frequency of sex. And now we'd like to talk more about when couples don't see eye to eye on a variety of halachic issues. Some of the issues are personal, but most of them are not, because when you are in a relationship and when you are in a family, the values that you subscribe to and the way you live your life and the way you adhere to the observance of Jewish law and tradition and the way that you want your children to adhere are all very, very meaningful. So when couples differ, there are challenges both from a couple's perspective, which I can address as a therapist, but also obviously from a perspective of Jewish law, which it would be great for you to address as the rabbi.
It's not simple at all. When a couple has halachic questions, when one partner wants to keep halacha a certain way and the other wants to keep it a different way, there's a possibility of compromise. It's even more complicated, however, when one wants to keep halacha and the other simply doesn't. Then there are a lot of issues that come into play, and it's not as simple as a yes or no answer in any given case.
Right. It's not simple. We were talking a little bit before, and you were saying how it seems to be like a breach of contract when two people get married and they share the same values, and then one person decides that they no longer hold those values, then it seems to be like a betrayal in some way.
That also applies even when someone becomes more religious, as well as when someone becomes less religious.
Absolutely. And I think that one important part of marriage and of intimacy and of a compassionate, understanding marriage is for each partner to be able to acknowledge where the other person is, stay curious and try to understand why the person feels the way that they do. But I do want to comment on the complexity. Yes, it's complex, but on the other hand, it's actually quite reasonable. And when I say that, it's because, we are constantly developing people. And even if you get married and hold certain beliefs, especially in our society, when you get married in your early 20s, it's fairly reasonable to develop different beliefs. We are constantly evolving and constantly developing. So what we might want to concentrate on is looking at what's behind the change. Is this an abrupt change? Is this a change that occurred over time? Has the discussion about religion and values been transparent all along? Or has there been secrets that were kept and there was suddenly an abrupt discovery, walking in on your partner on Shabbat when they're on the phone or that kind of thing?
This can be true even in situations where they started off with different halachic value systems. Not all couples begin in the same place, obviously, and then move apart. It can also work the other way. It can work that they started off without agreeing on halacha and they decided to make it work anyway. Truth is, we have sources that deal with all of these issues.
That would be a great way to start, is if you could perhaps bring some text and then we can take it from there.
Let me just bring one text. There are many texts that deal with this. One is more of an example rather than something which is comprehensive, but it's a Mishnah in Masechet Ketuvot in the 7th parak, Mishnah Vav. You can find this in our show notes as well. I'll read the Mishnah inside. It says, Ve'elu yotzot shelo b'ktuva. The following women are divorced without receiving their ketuvah. I'll explain in a moment. I'll just leave that now. Hoveret al dat Moshe v'yudit. Someone who violates the law of Moses and Jewish law. Ve'ezohi dat Moshe. What is called violating Moshe's law? Machilato sheno musar. If she feeds him forbidden food. Umasham shatu nida. If she has intercourse with him while she's in nida. Velo kotza la chala, she does not take chala. In other words, she does not make the bread allowed for him to eat. Venoderet ve'ina mekayemet, and she makes a promise without fulfilling it. Ve'ezuhi dat Yehudit, what's called Jewish law, which is separate, obviously, here from Moses' law. Yotza v'rosha parua, she goes out without her hair covered. V'tova bashuk, and she spins wool in the marketplace. Umedaberet im kol adam, and she speaks with all people. There's a lot of discussion about what all of this means, both in the Gemara and the Poskim, the Rishonim, the Achronim. From the Mishnah itself, one could argue, looking at it on a very simple level, that if a woman isn't religious, and I know this is talking about a man divorcing his wife, not the other way around, but we'll just take the Mishnah as it is right now. If she's not religious, he divorces her and she does not get the payment. She does not get alimony of the ketuvah. And that would include her not being religious and not being what we might call in a general term, tsanua, modest, which is the second half. However, it seems that most poskim do not understand it like this at all, because the examples given in the beginning, speaking of she feeds him improper food, she has intercourse with him when she's in nidah, it's not talking about her not being religious, it's talking about her tripping him up. In other words, things that she's responsible for, she is not allowing him to keep the halacha. Not that she doesn't keep it. It's not that she eats improper food. It's that she's doing it to him. In addition, the second half, it's not about tzniut according to many, if not most opinions. It's rather that these are elements and facts that seem to indicate in the society where this is just not done, that she's frankly sleeping around. That's how it's understood. Rav Ovadia Yosef says she's probably an adulteress. Not because, he says, it does not mean that a woman who is not tsanua is an adulteress. It means that in a society where no one does this, and this is indicative of having an affair, of having some sort of problematic extramarital affair.
Makes you wonder why it isn't more objective. If your wife has an affair, and again, this goes back to the laws of sotah, right, or
our last episode.
Yeah, if your wife has an affair and there are witnesses, then you would be able to divorce her without her ketubah, which means the sum of money that she's supposed to get. And here, even though we have the whole concept of sotah, which was in order to have a judicial way of dealing with a husband's suspicions, what we're learning from this Mishnah is if a husband so much as suspects that his wife is sleeping around, as you say, because she walks around and embroiders in the shuk?
Well, obviously, this is some sort of societal issue. We're talking about a woman doing something in public in a society where that thing is simply not done in public.
Well, fortunately, we don't deduce halakha or Jewish law from this Mishnah.
Absolutely. Then this Mishnah is dealt with in the Gemara as well, and not just the Gemara in Ketuvot, also the Gemara in Sota. There are Gemaras in Masechet Gitin that also talk about these issues. As I said, this is an example rather than any sort of comprehensive treatment. But as I mentioned, Rav Ovadia Yosef says, this does not mean that a woman who nowadays doesn't cover her hair loses her Ketuvah. He said, not at all. It means only if somehow something is indicative that the husband has strong suspicions, which this backs up, that she's having an affair. That said,
and if I were a therapist in the Mishnaic times, I might contend that it might be worthwhile for the couple to be communicating about this behavior.
Absolutely. And there are a couple of other questions that arise as well. When the Mishnah says she loses her ketubah, the question is, does that mean he must divorce her? He should divorce her? It's a mitzvah to divorce her? The Gemara asks this and doesn't answer it, and the poskim answer in different ways. And there's an additional question that comes up.
It could mean he's entitled to if he wanted to.
Exactly. It could mean, should he want to divorce her? She does not get a ketuvah, but he's allowed to not divorce her. Most say he doesn't have to divorce her. Some say it's a good thing. Some say it's neutral. And there's an additional point what comes out as well. What about marrying her in the first place? If she's exhibiting certain behaviors which would allow him to divorce her without paying her ketubah money, is it right for him to marry a person who already exhibits this behavior in the first place? If he knows, for example, to translate it into modern terms, that she's not going to keep the laws of Nida. If he knows that she is not going to feed him kosher food, in that case, is it right for him or even allowed for him to marry her? I won't couch this. I think that most poskim would say, while her not being religious may not be a reason not to marry her. That would not be something which would be ideal, to say the least. And even stronger, if she's not going to allow him to keep the laws of Nidah, I'm pretty sure the poskim would say they should not get married.
It's a very interesting question that you asked about why he would marry her, knowing that she is not willing to keep these laws. It's as though the belief is that they talked about it beforehand. They communicated about it beforehand. I wonder about that. I also wonder about the subconscious desire to act out through your choice of partner. And I think that this happens a lot in marriages, where on the one hand, the thing that ends up being a source of conflict and contention is also the thing that attracted you to your partner in the first place.
Right. Well, that's obviously a question for you, Talli. It must be very difficult for couples when each partner has a very different relationship with the halachic system.
You have to wonder, what was the writing on the wall? What were the predictions? In this case of the Mishnah, there could be an issue of mekach ta'ut, which we know means like getting a lemon when you buy a car.
Exactly.
Thinking one thing and getting something else, which is likely because I don't think that people had shidduch dates. I don't know.
I would think, though obviously I'm not a historian, I don't know. I can't imagine that in the times of the Mishnah, a couple would discuss whether or not they wanted to keep the laws of Nidah in advance. I assume it was pretty much an assumption that everyone just did that. And there wasn't such a thing as a non-religious Jew. That didn't exist. Judaism was the culture. It was the entire society. I'm not saying Judaism was what it is now, but it wasn't a choice the way it is now for many people.
Also, I wonder how many women, and there are some wonderful books about the women in, well, the Gemara, not so much in the Mishnah, but also some in the Mishnah, who were very opinionated, who had their own ideas about things.
Sure.
I think that the society, as it were, may have been more of a society where women didn't necessarily have opinions or voice them, and that those characters that we talk about, whether it's Yalta or other women of status or of opinion, those are yotzei min haklal. Those are exceptions rather than the rule.
Before we move on, let me ask a few questions, which
I want to ask you a question first.
Oh, okay.
Because you quoted this Mishnah, and the first part of the Mishnah made a lot of sense, because if you are committed to keeping Jewish law and your wife gives you food that is not kosher or doesn't go to the mikveh when you think she is going to the mikveh, this really does affect your ability to practice the way you want and to adhere to the law the way you want. It makes sense that that would be a breach of contract. The second part of the Mishnah is a little bit more difficult to swallow. And I'm wondering, what are we learning from this Mishnah?
Well, what do you mean it's more difficult to swallow? What do you mean by that?
The second part of the Mishnah, like I said, it's suspicions. It's something that the couple should talk about. The behavior doesn't seem to be behaviors that should necessarily cause a divorce right away without some sort of process of discussion, understanding what's going on in this marriage. Why is she going out to the shuk? Maybe she's not getting a lot of attention at home. It seems kind of harsh.
I think you're right, and I have a couple answers to deal with that. One of them is that, as I've said before, the Mishnah and the Gemara and halachic sources in general are trying to present stark cases to say what the technical law is. Whether or not this is a healthy situation or the way one should deal with it isn't necessarily the black and white law on the books. In other words,
legal. You're saying that this is legal, this is not.
This is a legal text, not a therapeutic text. Yeah. Exactly. So I think that's important to note. So when we try to turn a Mishnah or Gemara into a therapeutic text, if it's possible, sure, but that's not its purpose. And we have to understand the nature of what we're reading in any given case. The same way if I try to read a fictional story as an historical text, that's not its purpose. I'm going to miss what's being taught. I don't think it's doing justice to the Mishnah to ask it to be something that it's not. In other words, it's not supposed to be anything other than a black and white legal text. But beyond that, remember that this is talking about a very specific society. This is describing a society where probably men and women didn't talk so much the way we have nowadays. And that's not justifying it or saying that's a good thing. It's simply a reality. In a society where men and women didn't talk and a man suspects his wife, yes, it could be, you're absolutely right. Of course, I agree with you. It would be better if they would talk. Okay, good. They're not going to talk. Now what? So the question is whether there are legal justified grounds for him to deny her certain monies that she would otherwise be owed. Remember, if they're not talking, that doesn't mean they shouldn't talk. It means that they haven't talked. And let me say one more final point. This goes back to that idea about the technical legal details. It's not clear from the Mishnah whether he must or should divorce her. It means if he divorces her, does she get a certain payment? But there are those who say he doesn't have to divorce her. Based on what we've said until now, I'd like to throw out both to you, Talli, and to our listeners a few considerations or questions that have bearing on this subject when a couple is not on the same page religiously. One of them is, as we mentioned, who is doing the changing? I don't mean the husband or wife, but is the one becoming more religious? Is someone else becoming less religious? Because I think, and I'm not speaking now as a rabbi, I'm speaking just as a person, the way it looks to me from the outside, the one who's making the change is the one who is, quote unquote, changing the contract. In other words, if one partner wants to become more or less religious than they were when they got married, that person has to decide and explain why the other should follow him or her, because he's the one who's changing it or she's the one who's changing it. I'm not saying the other partner shouldn't follow along. I just mean that the burden of proof in a sense is on him or her because the contract's being changed. I think that's an important element of this discussion to acknowledge. Another aspect of the discussion is, what religious issues are we talking about? Are we talking about something like she doesn't want to go to the mikveh anymore, which affects both of them equally in a sense? If she doesn't go to the mikveh, he also halachically can't have intercourse with her. That affects both of them. Or let's say, for example, she used to cover her hair and now she no longer wants to cover her hair, which he might say in a broad sense affects him, but really it's her hair. It's not affecting him in any practical way.
By the way, that's a really common one. I see that in my practice a lot.
I'm sure. And I'm sure it's easy to say he shouldn't mind, but easier said than done. If it bothers the husband, it still might bother him. On the other hand, it's not directly affecting him. And then there are issues about when she turns on her phone on Shabbat. It affects the family in general, meaning it's not directly affecting him, but it might affect the way that he wants to raise his children, even though it's not him doing the act. It's not him sleeping with somebody who's a nidah.
Scott, you're raising some very important points. First of all, I want to mention that I wrote an article, a blog article that we'll attach to the show notes called When Your Spouse Goes OTD.
Off the derech.
Off the derech. We don't really want to call it off the derech. When your spouse goes a different derech would be the more popular PC way to put it. And as I said before, on some level, there is a spectrum. We don't expect that two people in a marriage are going to hold the exact same beliefs at all times. In fact, it is a normal developmental process to grow and to change and to evolve. And the way that a couple does this is the issue here. The way that they can stay committed to each other, but also differentiated. And I think I need to talk for a minute about the concept of differentiation, because it's not a concept that people always fully understand. Differentiation is not the same thing as separation. It doesn't mean that you don't care necessarily, or you don't want to engage in conflict because it's too difficult, or you avoid, or you pretend. Differentiation means that you can hold and contain your partner's differences because you're two different people. And the way that you respond to conflict or to differences is that you respond with an understanding that that person's feelings or that person's opinions are that person's, and that they're not there in order to rebel against you or to offend or hurt you. So differentiation is very much about the ability to hold on to yourself and to your beliefs, and to know that the other person's change in beliefs does not necessarily have to affect your beliefs. And so when you know that just because your partner is changing, that doesn't mean that you need to go along with them on that same path, and you feel safe and secure because you have your own strong sense of self, the chances are that you will become a lot less anxious and reactive to what your partner is telling you.
But when a partner changes his or her belief system, and let's assume they came in with broadly the same belief system and one partner changes, how does the second partner not feel personally rejected, in the sense that a person might feel, we came into this with a certain goal in mind. We were looking at the same end game. We were looking at the same ideals. And that's what brought us together. And even though I don't take it personally, I'm able to separate that from myself in terms of what she thinks of me. We're now looking at different goals. We're now looking at different things in terms of where we're going. How do we make sure this doesn't turn into a breach that we can't repair?
In a way, this conversation is a bit similar to the conversation we had about infidelity. First of all, let's acknowledge the partner who made the changes needs to acknowledge that the partner who did not make those changes, the partner who did not change the contract, is going to feel confused or hurt or betrayed. Those feelings are real. I would never say don't feel that. Those are real feelings, and those need to be validated and acknowledged. And that's usually the initial reaction, especially when the process has not been transparent. In other words, there are going to be couples that are very open and very authentic, and the discussion of whether or not I want to continue keeping this or what my beliefs are can be discussed openly. Those couples are going to experience much less of a shock than the couples who don't talk about this, avoid conflict or confrontation. Now, what usually happens in those cases is...
In the cases where there is or is not a shock.
In the cases where there is more of a shock, what often is the case is that there was a couple's dynamic in place which was not containing enough, whereby the partner did not feel safe enough to articulate or to explain or to divulge his or her changes in belief, believing that the other partner will be too rigid to accept them. And in many cases, even visiting the topic caused a reactivity. I can't believe you would say that. That really hurts my feelings that you would believe that, for example, which is what we would call enmeshed. It's not a differentiated reaction. It's a reaction which is based on the belief that if you are my partner and you don't share my belief, then I now am going to feel anxious and reactive because my sense of security and stability has been sabotaged.
You're rejecting me as well as my belief.
You're rejecting me. So in those cases, the partner will tend to, quote unquote, act out. They might eat non-kosher, but not mention it to their partner, or they might not keep Shabbat, but keep it on the down low. And in those cases, when eventually it gets revealed in more of a shocking way. And so the betrayal by the partner who reveals it will feel great, and that does need to be acknowledged. But we also need to look at the dynamic in the partner, because there are many, many questions that arise around why is this happening? Those questions need to be investigated. For example, is this acting out a type of aggressive or passive-aggressive way to respond in the marriage to feelings of control or oppression? Is this a marital issue per se? Or is this a natural process of development? My becoming not religious anymore, honey, has nothing to do with you, has nothing to do with my love for you, has nothing to do with my respect and appreciation for you. It's something that I'm going through. And that might have to do with a loss or a death or just a natural process of development. I, in my rational belief system, can no longer accept Torat Imi, my mother's Torah. It doesn't make sense to me anymore, and I don't want to adhere to it anymore.
Can I ask you what you would recommend to a couple? And I can also answer the same question. You can ask me from a halachic perspective, but what would happen if, to use one of our extreme examples, one member of the couple does not want to keep the laws of Nida anymore?
So that's really a question I was going to ask you more from a rabbinical point of view, but I think it's a very important question from a therapeutic point of view. And let me be clear that I'm not a very behavioral therapist. People think that they come to me and I'm going to give them advice, and I rarely give advice, but I do help them navigate the kind of communication that's necessary to understand each other. Let me throw out an example of this.
Please.
So I was working with a couple who had a lot of power struggles over a lot of things, not just religion. Religion was one of them, but also sex and money and in-laws, just about everything that you could have a power struggle about. They came in one day very, very, very upset with each other. They had had an enormous fight. She grew up in a very religious home, And she wasn't religious anymore. She didn't want to be religious anymore. She had stopped.
When they were married, were they religious?
So they were, but she wasn't so religious. He came from a more traditional home, and he had become religious as he...
Traditional in the sense of not fully Orthodox, you mean?
Not fully Orthodox. Right. It was a Sephardic home. So there was a great deal of respect for tradition, but his parents watched television on Shabbat, and there wasn't complete observance.
And now they're moving in opposite directions.
They had a very, very big fight because he saw her on Shabbat afternoon washing the floor. She has some anxiety and some little bit of OCD, and she likes things clean. And he saw her with the sponge and washing the floor, and he got angry at her for doing that. And she got angry at him for being controlling. And what she said to him was, "You and your stupid laws. Just leave me alone with you and your stupid laws." And they were both very hurt and very upset when they came in.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now, they could have come in and I could have said, okay, why don't we do this? Why don't we decide one Shabbat you'll keep, one Shabbat you won't? I don't know. I could have come up with something behavioral, but that was totally not the point. This was the point. I asked each of them to talk a little bit about their experience of what they felt, the feelings that they felt in the interaction with the other person, and what it reminded them of. And she was able to talk about when she grew up in a very rigid home where there was very little empathy and compassion. You did everything you had to do because you had to do it. And she really felt, and she would use this term a lot, religion was stuffed down her throat. And she would even point to her throat.
She physically felt it.
Physically, somatically in her body felt her throat tighten up by religion being pushed down her throat. And so when her husband was angry at her for what she perceived as a stupid law about squeezing, she was triggered into that same
It brought her
place.
back to her old home.
Now, he was able to really understand her and be compassionate to her. But when the real work happened was when that happened, but also what happened on the other side. He's a quiet guy. He rarely talks. I mean, he's a real introvert, and he doesn't share a lot emotionally, which is part of she's very emotional. He's not. So when I asked him to try to reenact or recover the feelings, he was able to talk about...
The feelings that when he saw her breaking Shabbat.
No, the feelings, not only when he saw her breaking Shabbat, but the feelings when she kept saying, "Your stupid laws."
Which was even more hurtful to him, right?
Well, he was able to talk about how when he was a teenager and he was becoming closer to religion, on Shabbat he would want there to be more
spirituality,
ruchaniyut,
right?
And his family made a lot of fun of him. His brothers would mock him. He had a very hard time being accepted, and he had to fight to be the religious person that he became. And so when she said to him, "Your stupid laws," it totally brought him back.
So each of them were triggering the other in a very, very deep personal way.
Exactly. And when she heard him talk about that, this whole new experience of compassion and empathy towards him was able to emerge.
That sounds like a good solution in the sense that they really were dealing with the underlying issues, the reason that each one was so upset about what they said.
When they were able to understand the triggers that they were causing in each other, what we understood too is it's not so much about what laws you're keeping and what laws you're not keeping. It's how you're acting towards each other. It's how much respect and compassion you can have towards each other. Respect being a very important word here, because really both partners deserve respect. The partner who wants to adhere deserves respect and deserves a way to be able to continue to adhere. But the partner who is no longer adherent or no longer observant or no longer religious or no longer a believer also deserves compassion, empathy, understanding as to what his or her process is that brought them to that place.
See, in this sense, Talli, with your approach, which is not a behavioral approach, you're able to come to that conclusion, which I think is wonderful. When someone comes to a rabbi for a halachic solution, they want to ask about behavior in particular, which makes it a little more complicated. Obviously, in some levels, it's easy. This is what you do. This is what you don't do. But in cases like that, it's not about understanding. It's about giving a specific directive of how to act. And in a case like that, I suppose one doesn't directly affect the other. It's more about the avirah, the atmosphere of the house. But when it comes to something like nidah, where she doesn't want to go to the mikvah or he doesn't want to wait for her to go to the mikveh. You have a much more complicated halachic
Absolutely.
issue.
Look, there's no question that what we did in that room, it was a powerful session.
I can imagine.
Yeah, we opened up the ability to now begin to navigate. And the navigating has to happen based on this kind of atmosphere of goodwill and mutual respect and compassion and understanding and differentiation, the ability for each person to hold on to their values.
And if somebody were to come to me with a halachic question about a matter like the one you mentioned, my feeling is that my initial reaction wouldn't be to give them a halachic answer. The first thing I would suggest would be to talk to somebody like you, or to figure out what's really going on, why they haven't been able to figure out a compromise that satisfies both of them. There are elements in the halacha which are quite absolute. When a woman's in nidah, when a couple is in a state of nidah, they may not have sexual intercourse. If she will not do a b'dika every single day, normally there are 15 b'dikot, the hefsek Torah plus 14 more, there are certain ways that b'diavad, after the fact, perhaps we can find ways to compromise in cases like that. In a case where compromise is possible and there is no willingness to compromise, or even in a case where compromise isn't possible and one or the other has to win out and they can't figure it out, my inclination would be that there's more than just a halachic question going on. If a couple can't respect each other to the point that they're at loggerheads, there's no way of working it out, I think that it's more than a halachic question. It is a therapeutic question. It is a question which requires more than merely a question and a resort to the sources.
Yes, there are so many variables here. There are personality variables. How rigid are you? And by the way, how halachically rigid you are has a lot to do with spirituality and devotion. But let's be honest, in many people, it has a lot to do with a rigid and anxious personality. And so being able to tease out what is what, it turns out that it's really surprising that people are willing to compromise, even what they thought might be very strict red lines for them, because of this concept of differentiation, because they know where they stand. They also know and respect where their partner stands. I have to be honest, it may not necessarily be according to what the rabbi would have suggested or wanted, but it may be okay for that couple because they can live with it. I've seen a lot of compromises happen in my clinic that I was surprised by.
The well-known idiom that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. When I teach future husbands chatan classes about hilchot nidah, tarat mishpacha, one thing which I emphasize constantly is to make sure they continue to ask questions of either me or whoever their rabbi is or whoever their halachic source is, only because when you learn a little bit, you can often see red lines as absolute red lines. And later on, when you assume something is not okay and you actually find out more, you find out, oh, there might be room to maneuver in this particular place. So it doesn't mean anything goes, obviously. But people who have a tendency to like red lines, people who have a tendency to, without putting it to clinical terms, have that OCD, this is okay, this is not, it has to be exactly like this, there's no maneuvering, that can be dangerous as well. Sometimes a rabbi is exactly who a person or a couple should speak to, because he might tell them, why are you being so upset about that? That's easy to navigate. That's not a big deal. And they just assumed that there was this intractable argument and contradiction between their positions, which may not be the case.
Also, there are issues that have to do with halacha, how you observe, and there are issues that have to do with, I guess you would call hashkafa, or belief systems, and how you want to educate your children. There's a lot more to religion than just what you eat and observing the laws. I mean, these are important
Absolutely.
issues, but I think far more important are what are the values that we hold dear to us and what are the values that we want to teach our children.
Well, Talli, that's exactly why this can be a problem. When it's merely halacha, and I say merely in quotes, there may or may not be an easy compromise, but that's one issue. But we also discussed the fact that a couple might have now radically different values, even though at the beginning of their marriage, they were on the same page, and now they have children, and one partner wants to educate his children in a certain way and the other partner in a different way.
But we have to acknowledge that this can be the case not only for religious issues. This is often the case for political issues. In one family, you can have...
Sports teams.
Exactly. And so surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, children are a lot more resilient than we think. And children are far better able than you might expect to be able to hold and contain the fact that Ima is this way and believes this way, and Abba is this way and believes this way. And what seems to moderate the quote unquote confusion, damage, or whatever you would want to call it, of there not being consistency is openness, discussion, communication, being able to talk about it, not being so afraid of conflict. And we said we were going to talk about the idea of conflict. First of all, if we look at our sources, it's all based on conflict.
Conflict is the means towards growth. And if nobody ever asks a question, you never learn anything.
And if nobody disagrees, you never go anywhere.
Correct.
And so people who avoid conflict end up suffering. They end up with some sort of heat pursuit, some sort of explosion that happens from acting out.
Avoiding conflict will lead to this explosion. It can't stay underneath and submerged forever.
Exactly.
So Talli, you mentioned before a couple who had this issue with Shabbat, a very dramatic case and pretty moving actually, where each one was triggering the other. And it wasn't really about religion. It was really about their upbringing and the memories that it related to. But what about a couple where there's no deep underlying emotional trauma that religion is masking or substituting for? It's just that one couple now has changed his or her belief system. He or she no longer wants to do X, let's say go to the mikveh. That's as an example. And the other one is not like that at all and feels very strongly that she should go to the mikveh. There's nothing else going on there. As I said, if someone asked me that question, I would first ask them to really figure out what's really going on. But let's say there isn't any other deep thing going on other than she doesn't want to do it and he does want her to do it. What does one do in a situation like that where it affects both of them? This is not a private matter. Even washing the floor is technically a private matter. This is something which affects both of them. He says, if you don't go to the mikveh, we can't have sex. And she says, well, I want to have sex, but I'm not going to the mikveh. Now what?
Well, every couple is different, but there's almost never not going to be something deeper there. I think that being able to talk about what is hard about going to the mikveh, a lot of times a woman who hates the mikveh really wants her husband to know how awful it is for her and to acknowledge it for her and to acknowledge too that if she were to do it for him, even though she hates it, it would be something that he would really appreciate and value. And from that place of, even though she hates it, she's going to go because she appreciates and values him, that may be something that can occur. Now, another example can occur where he decides that it's just not worth it for him, but it's really important that if he makes that decision, he's not resenting it. He's come to that decision.
I mean, just not worth it. Now he will not, quote unquote, insist that she go.
Yeah, because if she hates it so much or if it triggers her so much, most couples can find a way around it, whether it's to go to the beach and he'll watch her or to use a birth control where she doesn't have periods. I mean, a lot of couples manage to navigate.
I would think that the inability to compromise at all on either side is almost invariably indicative of some other problem. The fact that they're not willing to do anything.
If it's a power struggle, it needs to be dealt with. Also, the feeling of giving in, if it feels like you are a victim of that on either side of the equation, if you feel like a victim that you have to go to the mikveh, or if you feel like a victim that your wife won't go to the mikveh and you are continuing to have sex, either of those scenarios are not good. No system is perfect, and we need to be able, and I've talked a lot about integration, we need to be able to integrate the different sides of our lives. And if we are going to decide that I'm going to live with my wife, even though she's not going to the mikveh, and that's not perfect for me, I still need to be able to integrate that into who I am. I think that in many cases, what I tend to try to do with my couples when I do get with them to more of a compromise behavioral, let's talk about what we're going to do place, is to point out that what you do on your own time, what you eat or how you observe or don't observe in a way that doesn't affect your partner should be able to be understanding and containing and accepting of that.
Accepting even while not approving of it.
Yeah, you don't have to approve of it. Certainly, you shouldn't do things that you don't want to do that you don't believe in. Although I do have to say that there are many, many, many people who live a double life. In a sense, there are many people who don't believe, yet in order to maintain being part of the community, keeping their children in their schools, from a social point of view, they want to be Orthodox, but they're not really Orthodox. They don't really keep the laws.
In terms of their belief, right?
In terms of their beliefs, or even in terms of their practice, either on the down low or the couples together are like that. That does exist, and that's okay too. It exists a lot. If that's what they want to do. But going back to the situation of the private versus the couple, the things that affect the couple, if the man doesn't keep kosher, let's say, I think the expectation would be that he would respect keeping the house kosher, keeping the dishes kosher, because other people eat on them. And to some extent, this is how the couple may navigate nida as well.
I agree.
It doesn't always work out that way, and that needs to be understood and talked about. But that seems to be a good compromise for many, many couples. So I just want to add before we end, I think that this may bring up many questions and comments from people who may agree with what was said here. Some of you may not agree with what was said here based on our previous episodes.
If the past is prologue, we're going to get a lot of comments on this one.
Yes, exactly. We got a lot of comments on our infidelity episode. We aren't trying to necessarily promote a specific belief or point of view. Really, our goal is to encourage discussion. So you don't have to agree or disagree, and we might even disagree with some things that we say sometimes.
For sure. And in fact, all along, Talli, this entire podcast season that we've been doing together, one of my regular and recurring themes has been that my job is simply to present halacha as I best understand it. Whether or not a couple does what I've claimed they should do over the course of this podcast series, or perhaps better put, what I've claimed that halacha says they should do, is a completely different question. I'm just trying my best to say what halacha, as I understand it, says they must do. And certainly my job is not to falsify the sources, to present them as best I can. What a couple does, though, remains their autonomous decision. And what each individual member of the couple does remains his or her autonomous decision. And as long as we facilitate discussion while being true to the sources and saying what's out there and letting a couple then work on their own, I think we're doing our job.
And respecting each other, and respecting and being compassionate and curious, remaining curious, wanting to understand more about what the other person feels, not putting it down, not being disdainful of the other person's practice, whether they're not religious or religious, not making fun of it.
And it might hurt, and it can be very painful. But that hurt and pain cannot take away or detract from the acceptance and respect that each partner must maintain for the other at all times.
So have a great summer, everybody.
Enjoy the summer. Please make sure to go to intimatejudaism.com. That's intimatejudaism.com for our show notes. We'll have some additional sources there as well. Talli's article, some additional sources that I did not mention on the podcast. Also, make sure to write to us. We're waiting for you. Intimate Judaism at jewishcoffeehouse.com. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, and more. By subscribing, you'll know when we're back up after the hiatus, and you'll also be able to listen to all of our back episodes. Please remember when you're there to rate and review us. That helps us a lot. Thank you again for listening. I'm Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum. Bye.